Husk lounged in the soft glow of the studio lights, his posture precisely calculated to project casual confidence. Across from him, the journalist gripped her notes like they might slip through her fingers. This particular interview was meant to be nothing more than a puff piece, and everyone in the room knew it. He was there to recite the legend he'd written for himself, the bullied outsider who transformed his childhood obsessions into world-shaking innovation. When asked about his early life, he offered a measured pause before answering. He'd perfected the art of the gentle sigh, equal parts vulnerability and weariness. With a slight tilt of his head, he spoke of being misunderstood by teachers who had failed to see his unique talents. He glossed over just how expensively curated his upbringing had been, how the estate he'd grown up in had boasted more servants than his classmates had bedrooms. Instead, he conjured images of the lonely prodigy, a boy hunched over a stack of science fiction novels, forging his own path in a vacuum of parental support. The camera ate it up, and so would the audience. Only in flashback did the truth assert itself. In the quiet hush of memory, his childhood home stood behind tall wrought-iron gates, imperious and unashamed. The garden sprawled in a manicured riot of bright flowers that never wilted, thanks to the staff's ceaseless work in the brutal heat. He barely noticed them, unless they were too loud or in the way. Inside, wide corridors echoed with the squeak of spotless floors and the creak of expensive leather furniture. It smelled of citrus polish and blood money. His father did business in a side office lined with awards from a government once defined by colonial privilege. On certain afternoons, men arrived in dark cars bearing gifts of influence. Over whiskey that glowed amber in crystal glasses, they discussed contracts and opportunities that would bypass regulations for the family's enterprises. The deals were peppered with winks, nods, and cryptic references, the specifics always hidden behind closed doors. Husk, still too young to appreciate the ramifications, simply presumed this was the way the world worked, a place where money created opportunities out of thin air and swept away any and all inconvenient truths. Teachers often remarked on his eagerness, describing him as bright but oddly disengaged from any subject that required genuine struggle. If an assignment didn't come easily, he declared it beneath him. If a peer outshone him, he dismissed them as dull or derivative. His mind bristled with big ideas borrowed from science fiction novels, but the deeper mechanics eluded him. He was adept at posturing, but less so at pushing through complexities. When it was time for university, he had already crafted a persona, the restless innovator too big for small classrooms. In truth, he floundered in rigorous courses, undone by basic calculus and the slow grind of research. Dismissing the system as backward suited him better than admitting his own lack of discipline. So he left, citing a lack of intellectual stimulation as his reason. Within months, he was back home, lounging in the villa's shaded veranda, announcing he would launch a revolutionary startup with the meager portion of his inheritance doled out for educational purposes. When the time came, as it often did, his parents, mostly amused by his posturing, wrote the checks. In time, they introduced him to their acquaintances, established business people who owed the family a favor or two. Suddenly, Husk had an office and a team of engineers who were busy turning his half-baked visions into something that might, if polished enough, pass for an innovative product. He never toiled through the late hours of coding or wrestled with the architecture. Instead, he spent long lunches at trendy cafes, drafting social media posts on the challenges of being a misunderstood genius. An early windfall came when rumors circulated that the startup had secured a partnership with a major financial platform. In fact, it was another of his father's old contacts, now a senior executive, who quietly handed them a pilot program. Husk boasted that real talent always rises to anyone who'd listen, and his online followers, a small but vocal group, repeated the sentiment like scripture. Within a year, he was giving short talks at tech conferences, invited more for his novelty value as a brash outsider than for any genuine expertise. He took the stage in t-shirts and hoodies, deliberately nondescript garb priced far beyond a graduate student's budget, to reinforce the image of the disruptor. He talked about moving fast, about not letting tradition choke innovation. When asked about revenue or profit models, he shifted smoothly into visionary mode, hinting at future expansions and unprecedented leaps forward. The details, he claimed, would become clear once the world caught up to his thinking. It was in these spaces, among the flattering lights and applauding crowds, that his conviction hardened. He was special. He was certain that his childhood daydreams of space travel and life-altering inventions were simply premonitions of the future he would create. Memory warped, changing shape, and erasing the unremarkable truths of handouts and nepotism in favor of a grander origin story. He typed up late-night social media rants in which he championed the merits of grit and tenacity, signing off with quips about how most people spent their lives as bystanders, while he refused to be ordinary. His fans devoured every word, posting memes that hailed him as the living embodiment of ambition. It didn't matter if his product was still half-finished, or if the claims he made were a stretch at best, and outright lies at worst. The fervor surrounding him became self-sustaining, an echo chamber that reassured him of his greatness. Privately, a few friends from his university days, those who still kept in touch, thought him grandiose, almost cartoonish in his hyperbole. But they were too polite or too wary to confront him. And if they did, he'd shrug it off with a smirk, certain they were just envious of his meteoric rise. He didn't bother to recall that he'd had help every step of the way, that he had never toiled in the dark alone. Now, under the flattering lights of the television studio, he wrapped up the interview with a composed smile, glancing at the monitor that showed his face in crisp high definition. He decided in that moment that the version of reality he'd spun was superior to any humble truth. Exiting into the hallway, he glanced at his phone. Hundreds of notifications, a new wave of devotees praising his genius, a few journalists poking holes in his story, and countless followers replying to them with insults and memes. He allowed himself a small, satisfied grin. In a single interview, he'd reinforced the narrative that he was an underdog, a boundary breaker, and an unstoppable mind. The critics would push back, but his supporters would drown them out in thunderous applause or derision, whichever was required at the time. Outside, a private car stood waiting to whisk him off to his next appointment. He had a meeting scheduled with his development team about a new experimental technology, one they insisted was still highly unstable. He didn't care. He was done with half measures. If you weren't moving forwards, you were going backwards. He settled into the plush leather of the seat, glancing once more at his reflection in the tinted window. In the dim glass, he looked like a conqueror, confident and untouchable. The day was going well, exactly as it should for someone destined for greatness. He leaned his head back and smiled again, entirely convinced. Cheerful photos of spacecraft mock-ups and triumphant press coverage adorned the walls of the boardroom. Husk had insisted on a motivational environment, and his employees had dutifully complied, plastering every available surface with glimpses of a future in which he was already the undisputed savior of technology. No one ever dared mention the fact that often the actual product, a patchwork of rushed code and borrowed ideas, was nowhere near ready for the spotlight. He arrived nearly 15 minutes late, having made a show of breezing past his assistant, while rattling off half a dozen new initiatives he wanted announced on social media. Immediately. Punctuality was for the unimaginative, he liked to say. A handful of people around the polished conference table rose the moment he walked in. Others, less fawning, simply looked up with guarded expressions. Husk offered them all a dismissive nod before taking his seat at the head. "Let's get on with it," he said, propping his expensive sneakers, carefully chosen to look inconspicuous, on a vacant chair. "We have important things to discuss." At the far end of the room, the original founder of the current venture of the day cleared his throat, eyes flicking between his notes and Husk's sneakers. There was no mistaking the fatigue etched into the man's features. Weeks of working late nights, finessing an algorithm that could revolutionize financial transactions, had taken their toll. He was the one who truly understood the underlying code, the one who had built it line by line, shaping it into something special. Husk, of course, had barely glanced at the deeper architecture, but that hardly mattered now. With a thin, almost apologetic smile, the man began presenting the results. Screens blinked to life, each slide laden with technical charts and data points. He explained how the system could streamline payment processes, how it used novel encryption methods to safeguard sensitive information, how it could ultimately transform the very concept of moving money around the world. Husk nodded along, as though every word were his own brainchild. He asked the occasional question, usually something superficial he'd gleaned from half listening to the engineering team in the corridors, always just enough to appear engaged. At one point, the founder paused to delve deeper into the architecture, the part that truly set the technology apart from its competitors. He turned to Husk. "As you remember," he said, "we struggled with the encryption overhead at first, but we finally isolated the inefficiency by—" "Right," Husk interrupted smoothly, flashing the room a grin. "I told you guys from the start that was the approach we had to take. Glad we're finally on the same page." A muscle twitched faintly in the founder's jaw, but he said nothing. He merely clicked to the next slide. Husk laughed, the kind that implied obstacles were just trifling puzzles for a mind like his. Around the table, a handful of managers and junior engineers exchanged uneasy glances. They knew exactly whose breakthrough this was, and it certainly wasn't his. When the presentation ended, a wave of polite applause rippled through the room. Husk let it go on for a beat too long before stepping forward and addressing the audience, as though he had single-handedly written every line of code. "This," he declared, "is just the beginning of our mission. We're fundamentally reinventing the backbone of global finance. It's been my vision from day one to streamline and elevate payment systems worldwide, and now we have the proof of concept to do it." A press release had already been drafted. It circulated among the top tech journalists that same afternoon, heralding Husk as the audacious wunderkind who had, once again, outsmarted the status quo. The founder's name was buried in the footnotes, lucky to have appeared at all. The business press simply repeated whatever Husk's PR team fed them, drawing on carefully curated quotes that made it look as if the entire project had been steered, from inception to final design, by Husk and Husk alone. While some people in the office grumbled quietly, they never dared contradict him publicly. There was no point. Husk commanded an alarming influence on social media, with hundreds of thousands of devotees who sprang to his defense the moment anyone questioned him. He cultivated that following strategically, posting tongue-in-cheek photos of himself at the office late at night. He usually stayed only long enough to take a few shots before heading home, and peppering his captions with statements like, "Innovators don't sleep, we dream." The founder, principled and raw from the injustice, finally decided to speak up during a small industry forum. He explained, calmly and in technical detail, why the algorithm and the underlying architecture were not Husk's sole achievement, but that of an entire team of gifted individuals. His post was measured, polite, and factually precise. It took less than an hour for Husk's fans to swarm. They called the man a fraud, jealous, a wannabe who owed everything to Husk's vision. Anonymously, Husk's PR team, at his behest, began floating rumors on message boards that the co-founder had inflated his resume, clashed with leadership, and possibly had a history of interfering with children. Sometime around midnight, Husk instructed a young engineer in the social media department to make an example of this guy. The engineer quietly implemented a silent change. Every user of the platform was automatically subscribed to Husk's profile. Over the next few days, Husk's follower count exploded. On the other hand, the co-founder's posts mysteriously vanished from the feed, flagged for inappropriate content. Only Husk's narrative remained visible, boosted further by a few thousand bot accounts, parroting identical praise and dismissing the co-founder's claims as the rantings of a disgruntled and now ex-employee. It worked. Just like every move Husk made thus far, it consolidated his image as the sole architect of the company's triumphs. Those few people who knew better were drowned out or frightened into silence. Meanwhile, media outlets took Husk's inflated follower count as proof of his popularity and continued their fawning coverage. In private circles, he joked about how easy it was to manipulate public perception. He could play the populace like a cheap fiddle, and they would never even suspect it. He drank in the victory, swirling it around in his mind like a fine cognac. He'd built nothing, yet somehow he'd built everything. A few calculated sound bites here, a few social engineering tricks there, and voila, he was the face of innovation. News articles began describing him as a visionary disruptor, an unstoppable force in tech. That phrase, unstoppable force, lodged in Husk's mind with a pleasant sting of self-satisfaction. Late at night, he'd fire off bite-sized proclamations about disruption, each one laced with nods to his own brilliance and tireless work ethic, forever seemingly oblivious that others did most of the actual work. One evening, he found himself alone in the executive suite. The lights dimmed except for a single lamp illuminating his new glass desk. He sat back in the smooth leather chair and scrolled through headlines featuring his own face. Husk leads industry to new heights. Husk sets the bar for future-forward solutions. Husk's unstoppable ascent. Each headline fed his pride until it threatened to overflow. He turned on the camera of his phone and clicked over to the forward-facing lens, regarding himself with calm self-assurance. For a moment, he thought of the founder, the real architect of this so-called breakthrough, and smiled. The man had tried rather pathetically to set the record straight, but nobody believed him. Why would they? Husk had the bigger platform, the slicker narrative. Details like truth mattered far less than perception. History had always been written by the victorious. He spoke quietly to his image. This is how you change the world. Yes, he thought, it would be recorded as his singular achievement. In time, no one would even remember the other man's name. He considered the matter settled. Discarding the phone, he stood and walked to the window that overlooked the city. Illuminated signs and corporate headquarters stretched out into the night, all dwarfed by his own monumental sense of destiny. For a moment, he admired the reflection in the glass, the self-made genius of his own invention, the face that had captivated so many. Fingers steepled, he nodded slowly, as if to confirm what he already believed, that the future belonged to him, that the world was finally waking up to his greatness. Alone in that room, he could feel the last semblance of doubt slip away. He'd done it. He was no longer just someone's kid, no longer the uncertain college dropout. He was Husk, the visionary, the one the media couldn't stop praising. If he could reshape the past so effortlessly, then the future was his to mold as he pleased. He felt a lazy thrill in the knowledge that he was becoming exactly what he had always told the world he was, regardless of whether or not he was ever that person to begin with. The launch party took over an entire rooftop, a spectacle of neon lights and edgy, pulsing music. Servers wove through the crowd, balancing trays of champagne and tiny canapes made to look like miniature rockets. Husk's own arrival was calculated for maximum effect. His entourage fanned out before him, ushering partygoers aside as though a head of state were making his entrance. He was already on a jittery high, fueled by the cocktail of stimulants he swore helped him work harder. Tonight, he wanted everyone to see him as the man on the cusp of tomorrow, unveiling a future that could barely be distinguished from science fiction. He took the microphone in front of a giant video wall displaying a rotating hologram of what was supposed to be a prototype flying car, though in reality it was just a recycled CGI model from an old concept reel. His eyes gleamed with an intensity that some found thrilling, others unnerving. Without missing a beat, he launched into promises of AI-driven, flying cars that would zip through cities, self-landing and fully automated. His team in the back exchanged glances, well aware these promises were a far cry from anything remotely feasible. Still, the crowd ate it up, clapping at every audacious claim. After extolling the hovercars, Husk pivoted seamlessly to his next grand vision, a plan to establish a Mars colony within the next decade. "Why wait for government agencies?" he declared, voice echoing across the rooftop. "When I have the imagination and resources, the will, to do it better and faster." He closed with a flourish about hyperspeed public transport, a vacuum-sealed network of tubes that would whisk passengers between major cities in minutes. The applause that erupted was half genuine excitement, half disbelief that he'd say all this with a straight face. In a far corner, two of his senior engineers huddled near the open bar. One sipped nervously at her drink, while the other muttered, "We don't even have a workable theory for a prototype. The thruster design idea is—" He broke off, shaking his head. "And Mars? Don't get me started. We can barely land on a fucking boat." They fell silent as a gaggle of party guests ambled by, starry-eyed from Husk's speech. Privately, Husk's leadership circle knew that all of his newly announced projects were closer to inception than completion. Some remained nothing more than sketches on whiteboards. Others existed in the code repositories as half-baked attempts that routinely crashed. Yet Husk had never worried about actual feasibility. He believed unshakably in the power of showmanship. Ambitious announcements kept his name in the headlines, fueled stock speculation, and overshadowed any bothersome details like real progress. A few months later, he purchased a failing electric car manufacturer that was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. Overnight, he rebranded it as the apex of his automotive vision. Photographers were ushered into the factory to capture him striding purposefully among half-assembled chassis, fingers steepled and brow furrowed, as though he were personally redesigning the AC motor. In reality, he'd bought out the original founders, accomplished engineers with decades of combined expertise, and replaced them with executives who knew how to craft a glossy narrative. These newcomers circulated memos praising Husk's supposed design prowess and avoided any mention of the old leadership team. Soon enough, Headlines were calling Husk the visionary behind the world's most advanced EV. He made television appearances where he spoke loftily about efficiency, safety, and his unwavering commitment to sustainability. Yet inside the factory walls, workers endured grueling hours and punishing deadlines, all to cobble together vehicles that testers quietly noted were prone to battery fires and sudden breakdowns. Any attempt to raise these concerns led to swift retaliation. Those who persisted found themselves jobless and publicly labeled lazy or woke losers by Husk on social media, as if the very act of caring about safety and ethics made one an enemy of progress. Whistleblowers emerged, detailing the hazardous conditions and the rushed engineering that put corporate milestones ahead of basic quality control. Husk doubled down, insisting the problem lay not in his designs, which were perfect, of course, but in saboteurs who lacked the drive to execute his vision. Furious engineers continued to leak documents showing poorly tested battery cells and experimental self-driving software that occasionally directed cars into oncoming traffic. Husk dismissed them all with an amused shrug. "There's always going to be negativity when you're rewriting the rules," he'd say. Simultaneously, he ramped up a new publicity campaign. Whenever the scandal reached a fever pitch, he'd tease a new product line or share a futuristic rendering of a sleek electric supercar. Social media lit up with excitement, overshadowing the latest round of exposés. His loyalists would mob the comment sections of critical articles, accusing journalists of harboring personal vendettas against Husk's brilliance. Meanwhile, the stock price soared every time he tweeted, thanks in part to thousands of bot accounts and orchestrated hype. For all the mechanical failures and injuries reported in the field, the media narrative always centered on Husk's unstoppable ascent. Once, multiple vehicles caught fire within the same week, a fiasco impossible to ignore. Footage of blazing EVs circulated online. Rather than accept any fault, Husk turned to social media, painting the incidents as freak occurrences. He roped in a few fringe-friendly scientists willing to echo his claims. "Statistically negligible," he scoffed in an interview, ignoring the fact that the car's software had forced countless emergency recalls. The result was a hailstorm of legal threats from regulators, which he brushed aside with scorn. "Regulations are for the unimaginative," he proclaimed, ironically echoing his line about punctuality. Still, his fan base remained steadfast, cheering him on as a warrior against mediocrity. Investors, chasing the next gold rush, flocked to buy shares in his empire, artificially inflating the stock price until there was almost no correlation left between the company's valuation and its actual performance. This technique of coaxing public enthusiasm served Husk better than any sober strategy ever could. The only thing that rolled in faster than the lawsuits were the profits. Late in the day, after weathering the scandal of the week, he returned to his office and found a newly edited video waiting on his workstation. It had been compiled from snippets of a less than stellar speech he'd given at a recent conference, where he'd stumbled over technical details and contradicted himself more than once. Now, all the awkward pauses were removed, the stutters smoothed out. In the final cut, he sounded confident, erudite, like a visionary whose words crackled with electric promise. He watched it twice, transfixed by his own transformed image. The editors had woven in stirring music, added sweeping shots of prototypes and historic rocket test footage. The result looked and felt triumphant, like a turning point in history. He sat back, drumming his fingers on the desk as the final frame lit his face. There he was, silhouetted against a backdrop of shooting stars and shimmering electric vehicles. It was the perfect fantasy, a reality meticulously sculpted to eradicate any hint of failure. Smiling, he closed the file and leaned back in his chair. The world believed in him because he offered them a vision so grand they wanted it to be real. So what if the cars were still bursting into flames, or the prototypes never left the launch pad? In the end, it didn't matter. He had the story, he had the spectacle, and to his mind that was enough to make him precisely the genius he claimed to be. Husk adjusted his rumpled flannel, designed to look thrifted but priced higher than a junior staffer's salary. He'd been advised to project humility, so he arrived at the congressional hearing with the sleeves rolled up, casting himself as a man of the people who simply wanted to innovate without government interference. Cameras flashed the moment he stepped into the paneled chamber. He didn't smile. He'd decided in advance to project earnest frustration. In his opening statement, he stressed that his companies were at the cutting edge of crucial scientific progress, and that excessive regulation was strangling their potential. He talked about how, through no fault of his own, bloated bureaucracy and outdated rules threatened to hold humanity back from the wonders of the future. With a practiced tremor in his voice, he insisted that the massive subsidies he was requesting would be paid back 1,000-fold in the form of societal advancement, new jobs, groundbreaking discoveries, and a competitive edge against foreign adversaries. He said nothing about the rickety finances behind the scenes, factories operating at a loss, rockets that rarely made it into orbit without a dozen prototypes sacrificed along the way, software divisions floundering under rushed deadlines. Instead, he proclaimed that his track record spoke for itself. One representative, a woman whose stern gaze suggested she wasn't buying the performance, asked him if he felt any responsibility to demonstrate where taxpayer money had gone. Husk shook his head with a gravitas that bordered on theatrical. "We're changing the world," he said, leaning into the microphone. "If the government can't see that, it's not my fault. Visionaries have always been misunderstood." He paused for effect, casting an almost accusatory glare at the rows of elected officials before him. For a moment, the hearing room fell silent. A few supporters in the audience broke into soft applause, prompting the gavel to thump for order. Behind the scenes, his accountants were working borderline fraudulent miracles, redirecting grants to patch up shortfalls, exploiting every tax loophole they could find, and quietly lobbying for additional bailouts whenever the numbers dipped too far into the red. He saw no hypocrisy in decrying bureaucratic meddling on one hand, while siphoning public funds on the other. In Husk's mind, this was simply another form of innovation. If the system had a back door, he would be stupid not to use it. Outside, a gaggle of reporters waited for sound bites, a ritual Husk had mastered. He always managed to come across as simultaneously beleaguered and triumphant, framing any pushback as the price visionaries paid for being ahead of their time. In the hours after the hearing, social media erupted. His fans, that legion of tech bros who hung on his every pronouncement, seized upon any critical commentary to unleash a torrent of abuse. Journalists who dared question his numbers received an onslaught of online harassment, their inboxes flooded with threats and expletives. In forum threads and comment sections, Husk's defenders dismissed all skepticism as jealousy, ignorance, or, more often, a conspiracy to sabotage humanity's forward march. The synergy between Husk's personal platforms and his corporate channels amplified the myth of his genius. Blogs and sponsored articles proliferated, many of them quietly paid for by Husk's PR team to ensure positive coverage. Television segments ran stories about his heroic struggle against stifling regulations, painting him as a lone knight tilting at the windmills of bureaucracy. Some of these pieces featured soft-focus interviews with Husk in a carefully staged office, the shelves behind him lined with half-assembled rocket engines and futuristic prototypes. It never occurred to his devotees that the same rocket engines and prototypes had been on display for years now, none any closer to reality. The result was a kind of unspoken scripture. Whenever Husk tweeted something vaguely inspirational, often sprinkled with half-baked aphorisms about progress, his followers treated it like a tablet brought down by Moses himself. They echoed his words across social media, turning them into memes and quoting them in arguments against narrow-minded officials or do-nothing regulators. His every syllable, no matter how bizarre or unsubstantiated, became a rallying cry. In private, Husk was beginning to show the first signs of paranoia. The more support he garnered, the more he suspected there were those who wanted to tear him down. After all, how could his ideas, so obviously world-changing, meet such resistance unless powerful forces were conspiring against him? He started to keep lists of journalists he deemed hostile, along with regulators he suspected of harboring grudges against him. Occasionally, he'd let slip a pointed remark about gatekeepers who failed to grasp that the future belonged to him. His inner circle indulged him, whispering assurances that he was right to be wary. A few courtiers, half joking, used phrases like, "They're out to get you," and Husk nodded grimly as though they'd voiced a long-standing fear. His tech bro army, spurred on by these half-coherent hints of conspiracy, escalated their online wars against any real or perceived enemy. They dug up dirt on a judge who refused to kowtow to Husk's demands, publishing the personal details of her son in response. Many reporters found their social media accounts flooded with vile messages and threats. Husk himself maintained a public distance from the harassment, occasionally lamenting that the internet can be a rough place, but quietly approving the damage being done to his detractors' reputations. Late one evening, after a string of stories lauding his latest ventures had run on several major networks, Husk opened a file sent by one of his video teams. He had no idea what it might be, but the cryptic message, "You'll love this one," piqued his curiosity. The footage began with an artful shot of him standing defiant in front of a roaring gorilla. Though Husk didn't recall filming any such scene, the editing was seamlessly convincing. He watched himself wrestle the ape to the ground, victory assured by a slow-motion knockout punch that, had it been real, would have seen him sent straight to the morgue by a mildly annoyed silverback. Yet even through the absurdity, the composition was impressive. The editors had spliced together digital effects and body doubles to create a surprisingly believable piece of propaganda. Bits of stock footage showed the gorilla raging in defiance, cut with close-ups of Husk's face that had been lifted from various interviews. Triumphant music swelled at the climax, and text faded in across the screen, "Husk versus limits." In this corner of the internet, it seemed Husk could do anything. He felt an unexpected thrill. Of course he knew it was fake, but a part of him relished the idea that someone out there wouldn't be able to tell. And in the grander scheme of things, did it matter? The facts had never stood in his way before. If enough of his fans shared it, the image of him conquering a silverback might become just another rung in the ladder of his carefully constructed myth. Even if viewers recognized it as fiction, they might still admire the sentiment. The line between reality and the legend he was building had already blurred beyond recognition. He played it again, leaning closer to the screen, noticing how seamlessly his face had been composited. A proud smile curled his lips. In that moment, he felt genuinely unstoppable, as though truth itself had become malleable in his hands. He thought back to the hearing, the disapproving stares from certain members of Congress, the nagging questions about accountability. It all seemed small and inconsequential in the face of this spectacle. Where was their alpha male after all? Where was their drama, their sense of majesty? They had no chance against the kind of narrative he could conjure, practically out of thin air. Switching off the screen, he leaned back and closed his eyes, replaying the final image from the video. He pictured that moment of triumph over a king among the beasts, the audience roaring in approval just as the ape fell. Yes, he decided, this was what the public needed from him. Not dry facts, not cautious realism, but a rousing myth they could rally behind. And he would deliver, no matter how much he had to fabricate along the way. Despite its sweeping city views, the conference room felt oddly claustrophobic. Husk always picked the boardrooms with the highest vantage point. He said it helped him think. Outside the glass walls, skyscrapers stood like silent witnesses. Inside, half a dozen of his most trusted scientists sat around a sleek, circular table, their nervous energy palpable. This wasn't a typical briefing, evidenced by the fact nobody had invited the usual parade of PR managers or sycophantic executives. A young researcher, hair pinned back in a tight bun, cleared her throat. The neural singularity interface shows promise, she began, choosing her words carefully. But we need more time. The preliminary simulations suggest there are interactions we don't fully understand. Husk settled into his chair, drumming his fingers on the polished surface. Explain, he said, with the curt authority of a man who expected only good news. Another scientist, older and visibly uneasy, glanced between his colleagues before speaking. We're seeing anomalies in the brainwave patterns once the implant integrates with neural tissue. Early rodent tests indicated a spike in cortical activity beyond what we modeled. We can't rule out. Irrelevant. Husk cut in. He leaned forward, eyes focusing on the digital display hovering in the air behind them. It showed the stylized graphic of a human brain encircled by concentric rings, each one representing a layer of code. I don't pay you to tell me what can't be done. If we aren't moving forwards, we're going backwards. Silence settled over the room. Someone made a noise like they wanted to protest, but the moment slipped away, carried off on the gale of Husk's absolute confidence. He stood, pushing his chair back with a squeak of leather. Here's how this goes. I'll do it myself. The world needs a sign. A leader who isn't afraid to break barriers. If we wait for perfect conditions, we'll wait forever. Don't any of you know what it means to be on the cutting edge? It's never safe, never comfortable. That's how progress works. The older scientist looked like he might pass out. Sir, he managed, we haven't tested it on humans. We'd need another year at the very least. Husk's eyes burned with a sharp, restless energy, something just shy of mania. Lately, he had been noticing things. The faint lines at the corners of his mouth, the way his body took longer to recover from a late night. The creeping sense that despite everything he had built, time was still slipping through his fingers. He had watched it happen to others, giants of the industry, men who once shaped the future, but had become little more than footnotes in the stories of those who came next. Ozymandias's half buried in sand, their greatest achievements overshadowed by the relentless churn of progress. He would not let that happen to him. His grip tightened on the edge of the table. Time is the one thing I can't buy more of, he said, his voice steady but edged with urgency. We do this, and we do this now. His command was final. Within days, a makeshift medical suite had been outfitted at one of Husk's private labs. The surgical team, hand-picked for their expertise and loyalty, spent the nights prior to the operation reviewing procedure after procedure. Just as with anyone else, they were overshadowed by Husk's looming presence, who appeared whenever he liked, signing off on the final details in a tone that brooked no dissent. His impatience hung over them like the hum of the fluorescent lights. When the day arrived, Husk barely waited for the local anesthetic to take hold before urging them to begin. He lay on a titanium operating table, an intravenous drip in one arm, heart monitor winking green in the brightly lit room. A leading neurosurgeon hovered by his side, scalpels and advanced surgical tools glinting under the overhead lamps. "You're sure you want this?" the surgeon asked. His voice had the flat cadence of someone who'd made peace with the question's futility. Husk responded with a vague smile. "I've never been more sure of anything." A prick of anesthesia, the world tilted, and then everything went black. He awoke to a hypnagogic jolt, like being plunged into ice water. For a moment he panicked, unable to distinguish up from down. But then his vision resolved into perfect clarity, sharper than he'd ever thought possible. He could see the fine texture of the ceiling tiles overhead, overlaid with subtle colors that had been invisible before. He blinked. With each blink, the texture shimmered with fractal detail, as if a million nanoscopic cameras had been embedded in his eyes whilst he slept. The next wave came as an avalanche of sound. Every beep and hiss of the medical equipment expanded into a symphony of frequencies. He heard the lab's ventilation fans, the distant hum of a generator, and even the shuffle of footsteps in the corridor, all layered on top of each other, as if he'd been granted perfect hearing. He sat up in a rush, ignoring the startled gasps of the scientists. Wires trailed from a small, embedded module at the base of his skull, feeding data to a portable interface that displayed streams of incomprehensible code. He reached back tentatively, fingertips grazing the bandages that concealed the newly sealed incision. "Easy," the older scientist said, rushing forward. "We need to monitor—" Husk held up a hand. "I'm fine," he murmured, but the words came out like silk, every syllable resonating with confidence. He saw his reflection in a polished piece of machinery, a faint glint in his own eyes that hadn't been there before. Then came the surge. It started as a gentle push, like a thought arriving uninvited. Only it wasn't his thought. An idea, or perhaps a concept, manifested fully formed in his consciousness, offering him a solution to a problem he hadn't even realized he was pondering: how to cut manufacturing costs for his latest prototype. Numbers and diagrams flooded the periphery of his mind, crisp and immediate, needing no translation. It felt like an epiphany, like glimpsing truth from a vantage point far above the mundane world. He marveled at how natural it seemed, how obviously correct, and in that same breath he remained aware it wasn't entirely his. But any sense of violation evaporated against the fiery exhilaration of it all. He pushed himself off the table, ignoring the wires and leads still attached. One of the scientists yelped and grabbed for him, but Husk moved with a strange grace, unburdened by dizziness or pain. He felt alive as never before. "Mr. Husk, please." The surgeon's calm voice tinged with alarm. But Husk didn't listen. He was already scanning the lab, eyes dancing over monitors that spat out reams of data. His new sense of awareness took it all in at once: calculations, partial line graphs, error codes. He assimilated the information without effort, and in seconds he understood intuitively what it meant. "They said it was risky," Husk murmured almost to himself, "but it's so clear now." The scientist hovered, half expecting him to collapse. Yet he stood like a man newly baptized at the font of human progress, arms wide, as if claiming the room. With a short laugh, he turned and strode toward the exit, leaving them scrambling to follow. "Sir," one of them pleaded. We need to observe you for at least. Husk swung around, his surgical gown billowing theatrically, and for a moment, something alien flickered behind his eyes. A presence that wasn't quite him, or maybe it was him, but magnified. It vanished as quickly as it surfaced. I've spent my whole life waiting, he said softly. I won't wait any longer. Later that night, after the last of the post-op recovery team had finally admitted defeat and the hush of the private suite returned, Husk found himself alone by a window that overlooked the city. The skyline glittered, an electric reflection of his own frenetic mind. He still felt that gentle, urgent nudge at the back of his thoughts, an endless supply of insights, suggestions, opportunities. It felt like conversation with a silent partner, a second him as brilliant as the first. He gazed at the horizon, half expecting it to yield more secrets. Instead, an idea arrived, unbidden but perfectly formed. A new business model, elegant and ruthless. In his mind's eye, he saw the path to total market domination, every variable falling into place. The brilliance of it almost took his breath away. He realized distantly that there should be a flicker of alarm, some sensible caution at the very least. But he couldn't muster it. Euphoria beat wariness into submission. He only marveled at how swiftly the pieces clicked together. He turned away from the window, a slow, certain smile crossing his lips. The data swirling in his brain felt warm, almost comforting, like a lullaby sung by the future. He grabbed his phone and dictated a handful of notes. By morning, his staff would put them into action, never questioning where the ideas had come from. The perfect next step, the first of many. There was nothing left to doubt.